grace as we learn to upload and download and post and do everything that we need to do. The one from Monday around daycare centers and nursery schools is now available. The one from Tuesday around buildings, the PowerPoint is available now on the website. The actual Zoom meeting, we ran into some technical difficulties, but it should be available by around 12 o'clock today. And then this one will also be available to you. Just to let you know that that information will be there for you. And so without any further ado, Susan.
Actually, I need to get a phone number again. We've got a 503-302-1040. Who are you?
Sandra Larson Union.
Okay. Hold on, Sandy. I'll rename you. Okay. So let me try to get my PowerPoint shared with you so you can see it. Hold on 1 second. Screen. Okay, can everybody see it? Yes, okay, I can see only Garrett, but Garrett's shaking his head, so I'm assuming that everybody else can see it too. So we're going to be focusing on worship today. Hopefully that's why you're here. We are going to be talking about what should and shouldn't happen in worship. I'm choosing those words carefully. We will cover what must not happen in worship, and then what's also recommended to not happen in worship, as well as what obviously we'd like to have in worship. We are not going to discuss issues around the reopening of a church's campus. That's what we did on Tuesday. I'm going to assume you have that material. If you don't, you should go back and look at that if it impacts your worship services. And then finally, I call your attention to the guide that I've put together. I also put this link in the chat. It will have the different resources that I'm referring to on the last page of it. So you may want to look there along the way. The key resources that I'm going to be using today are the statement from New York, Reopening New York Guidelines for Religious Services, the information that our denomination has put out called Returning to Public Worship, Theological and Practical Considerations, and then the information that the Ecumenical Consultation on Protocols for Worship has put out this past week called Resuming Care-Filled Worship and Sacramental Life During a Pandemic. And so I'll be referring to those. They are all listed in the bibliography at the end of the document that's on the Presbytery website. So to remind you, if you were on the call on Tuesday, or if you were not, so that you're aware, we are now at the point where congregations can return to face-to-face worship in a building under certain conditions. They must be a maximum capacity of no more than 25% of maximum occupancy of a building. This is only for religious or funeral services that are indoors. This is not for other activities in your building. If you have more than one building with separate entrances, you can do up to 25% of maximum capacity in each of those buildings, as long as there are separate entrances and exits. And you can find the mandatory requirements at the Reopening New York Guidelines. So before you do worship, you must come up with a plan. I will say this again because I've gotten a series of questions on it since Tuesday. Whose responsibility is it to come up with the plan? It is the sessions. It is not the pastors. It is ultimately the sessions. You can come up with a team that's going to do that on behalf of the session and give them commissioning powers to make the decision. You can have them do the work and then come back to you as a session, but the session must have a plan before reopening your worship, your face-to-face worship. If there's worship happening on your campus, and by your campus, that could include your parking lot, it could include your field in your backyard. If it's happening on your campus, you must have a safety plan in effect before you open. And that plan, what happens with it? Not only do you implement it, you must conspicuously post it in the buildings. Now, not everything we're covering today has to be in that plan. You don't have to put, well, I'm planning to have a quartet sing and they will be standing in the four corners of the sanctuary in your plan, for instance, right? But it will be helpful if for some of the other guidelines that we're covering today to make sure they are written down somewhere and decided and approved by the session, even if they're not in your plan. So here we go. As you plan liturgy, starting point, we're being asked to keep services, including sermons, brief to lower the risk of public exposure in public gatherings, all right? So that means stripping your service down to what needs to be there at the beginning. You can always add later, but keeping it brief. Right? You need to plan how you're going to manage the number of people all along the way as they enter the sanctuary, so they're keeping social distancing as they come in. As they participate, how are they keeping social distancing? As they leave worship and get into their cars or walk home, how will they do social distancing? You need to plan how you're going to screen the attendees for the COVID-19 possibility that they have the virus. And you need to make sure that people don't congregate before or after worship. Those are starting points as you think about your liturgy and people coming into it. You also need to be sure to continue to consider what to do for those who remain at home. This may include continuing whatever form of worship you've currently been offering for the past weeks, or finding a way to include those at home and those who are working face-to-face equally in the service you design. So if you're going back to face-to-face worship, a good number of your people will not be able to come. No high-risk individual, that our denomination has said, and they actually use the number 50, but New York's 55, but New York State has used 60, so I put 60 down. Those over 60, those with underlying conditions, those who have family that are high risk, etc., should not be attending face-to-face worship at this point. So you need to make provisions for those people to continue to worship with you virtually in some other way. Again, you can't stop somebody who's 85 from walking into the building. You don't have a way to do that. But you're to encourage them to attend virtually rather than face-to-face. You need to be careful as you resume worship about how you announce the face-to-face activities so you don't exclude those who have to continue to shelter at home. You want them to feel equally included in all of your congregational life. So you need to think about how that's going to happen. And your children in your congregation, when they attend, if they're coming in, must remain in the care of those in their household unit. They should not be allowed to be in the care of others, so no church school, for instance, and they should not interact with other people while in worship. Now we're going to take, sort of came up with categories, so we're going to work with the spoken word, then we'll work with music, then we'll move on to a couple other things, but we'll take the spoken word first. Actions involving the voice in any way have the risk of producing aerosols that can spread the virus. So because of this, those leading worship must be prepared to wear a face covering if another person might come within 6 feet of them. So if you're thinking, for instance, of processing down the aisle at the beginning or the end, you need a face covering as you do that. If you're thinking of coming in from the front and you're going to be within 6 feet of people, you must have a face covering when you do that. If there's any possibility, if you have more than one person leading worship and they're not from the same family unit, of people coming near each other as, let's say, one person is leaving a mic and another is coming towards it, you must have a face covering on while you have that exchange happen. So wearing a face covering when they come within 6 feet. You need to encourage all speakers to keep their voices at a low volume. So we're being asked, if possible, to have them wear wireless microphones. The kind of Projecting that I was taught to do in seminary when I preach is not something that can happen in these days with the COVID virus. It raises the risk of aerosols way too much in the air. And so even if you're projecting with a mask on, that becomes problematic. You need to instead talk very quietly and preach very quietly and read the scriptures very quietly and have the mic do the work instead. No unison prayers, no responsive readings where they're going to be a group of people talking together. Again, because of the problems, even if everybody is wearing a mask, there have now been studies that show even with masks, the aerosols go through them and can be problematic for other people if somebody turns out to have been sick. So we've eliminated unison prayers and responses, that they're not to be happening in the service. Preachers and all other people who are speaking should be at least 12 feet away from other people when they're preaching. Now, ideally, this is not mandatory, this next part, but it's encouraged. Preachers would wear a face mask when they preach, both to protect others from the aerosol and to model to others in the congregation the importance of wearing masks whenever you're together. So that's the spoken word. Now we're going to go on to music. And given what I've said about the spoken word, the next part shouldn't surprise you what I'm going to say about music as well. First, you should refrain from any kind of congregational singing. If speaking, even at a quiet level, produces aerosols that are problematic, singing produces even more aerosols in the building. And so congregational singing is just a no completely at this point. Other activities involving singing, and here we're talking about the choir, soloists, musical ensembles, should be avoided unless you can keep minimally 12 feet of separation between each individual. And that includes the individuals doing the singing and the individuals who are in the sanctuary. And it's encouraged to have as well physical barriers that can reduce transmission. And if you look at what the suggestions for physical barriers are, there are suggestions of putting up plexiglass on either side of singers. And it becomes very, if you're thinking of 4 people singing, each with a plexiglass booth sort of around them, that's the suggestion of how you do singing of an ensemble in a sanctuary while there are people in there. Woodwind and brass instruments, for exactly the same reason, are discouraged. You should not be using them at the moment. So no, I play flute, right? No flute in your sanctuary, no saxophone, no trumpet, no, you get the idea, right? In your sanctuary at the moment. Piano, keyboards, stringed instruments, percussions are all fine. So you can add them back and have music in those ways in the sanctuary with no problem. If those performing, and by performing I'm using both choir and I'm using clergy, if you wear robes, New York State is saying they have to be laundered at home in between gatherings. So clergy, if you decide once you go, I've seen a lot of your videos for live stream and you're wearing your robes. If you decide you're going to continue to do that once you are back in the sanctuary with people, you must take your robe home in between and have it laundered. Choirs, if you're going to have an ensemble and 4 people are going to be wearing robes in the ensemble to perform, each of them is being asked to take their own robe home and have them laundered, all right? So that you're not contaminating one person with the aerosol from another person that could be on their robe. And this is every time the robe is worn. You should avoid sharing instruments. So obviously you can't have musicians bringing their own organ, right? But other than that, if you're having a percussion instrument or you're having a violin come in, musicians should bring their own instruments with them when possible. And any instruments used in the service have to be thoroughly disinfected in between services. So those of you who are clergy on this call or session members on this call, you need to be in touch with whoever is your professional musicians about how you can safely clean the instruments that are in your sanctuary in between services so that you're not damaging them, but so that they are disinfected. To keep up on research on music during COVID-19, the Hymn Society is doing the best it can to try to pull together all the information that's coming out on singing and instruments and so forth, and the effect that they have on the virus has by their being used in the sanctuary. So I'd recommend you make sure that whoever's doing your music in your services keeps on top of that site for you, and you may want to look at it as well. So those are the sort of general guidelines for music. Physical contact in the sanctuary while you're worshiping, or in any building while you're worshiping. You should consider removing Bibles, hymnals, pamphlets, other similar items from your pews to avoid contamination risk, especially if you're going to have more than one service and you won't have time to clean them in between. Anything you leave in your pews has to be cleaned once a group leaves before a group comes back into that space. And that's whether they're coming back in an hour later or whether they're coming in a day later, or they're coming in 3 days later. You're obligated to clean and disinfect anything in the space in between. So take out anything you can do without in the space. You need to limit the touching of pulpits, podiums, seating, doors, railings, and other shared surfaces, as well as shared objects. So if you have a Bible up in front and one person is going to come and do the Old Testament reading, and then somebody else is going to come up and read from the Christian scriptures, you need to make sure that the Bible is somehow not touched by both people, or that the people who are touching it wear gloves when in contact with it, or that they sanitize their hands right before and right after the contact. So anything that's going to be touched. This includes, I've gotten since Tuesday, some questions about, well, what happens if we move our service outside and use a mic outside instead, with different people just staying distance except when they come to the mic? If they're coming to a microphone instead of a pulpit or a podium, the same thing is the case. You need to either not have them touching the mic or require them to wear gloves when they're in contact with the mic, and when gloves as well as a mask, which they would have on anyway, and require them to sanitize their hands before or after contact. So this is anytime there's a common surface that will be touched or that people will be near and could be breathing aerosols on. Any protective gear, gloves or masks, have to be either cleaned or replaced after use, and they cannot be shared. And you must train people on how to wear and discard those masks at the end. You need to refrain from printed bulletins. People have to touch the bulletins to hand them out. People may pass them from one person to another. And because we're doing a very different kind of worship, you're not going to be saying, all right, now in your bulletin, see hymn number 531. You're not going to have hymns. You're not going to have unison prayers for people to be reading, etc. So printed bulletins are a no. People can take out their phones and call up a bulletin. You can project the bulletins on a wall, but no printed bulletins. If you need, and this is a big if you need physical offering plates, make them available in prominent places that can be easily accessible without people having to break social distancing contact, so that they don't need to be passed. All right. Ideally, both the denomination and New York State has encouraged that you do offerings electronically instead. You need to prohibit all physical contact during the service. This includes shaking hands, hugs, and obviously passing of the peace. Instead, either nod to each other, bow, do some sign to each other, use words in sign language, teach your congregation how to say, peace be with you or Christ be with you in sign language, and have them do that, but no physical contact. Communion.
Take a break for a few questions in between,
Sure.
please.
Sure.
How about microphones?
Microphones have to be, if you're not using lavalier mics that are worn by individuals, and so they would be the only one on them, a mic that's going to be shared by more than one person has to be disinfected in between persons using them.
Okay. There's a question about, there's been a report that after 7 days, cleaning is no longer required in Connecticut. Is that true for New York?
It's not stated in New York. What New York says is that you are required to adhere to the cleaning and disinfectant requirements that the CDC and the New York State Department of Health have put up. And you have to keep cleaning logs of how you've cleaned. That's the requirement. And New York, as far as, at least I didn't check yesterday, but as of Tuesday, has not put up anything waiving that requirement, even if it's longer. And that's true not just for cleaning your sanctuary, but that's why the robes become problematic. I don't know about other clergy, but I would wear my robe maximally once a week. And so if the new Connecticut law was in effect, I could take my robe home and bring it back the next Sunday with no problem. But that's not what New York currently has in effect. New York has an effect that things have to be cleaned anyway.
It was heard that sitting in a balcony is dangerous for people sitting below. Is that true? Even with wearing a mask? Have you heard anything about that?
You've got the same problem with aerosols, because now you've got aerosols that can fall down on somebody as well as be above. So it's the same kind of question that we talked about a little bit on Tuesday around fans and air conditioners and filters and how you get fresh air in there. It's the aerosols that are projected that are the problem, and how long cleaning is. So if you had somebody perform a solo in your sanctuary last week when nobody was in there, from New York State's perspective, you should still clean the whole sanctuary afterwards, because the aerosols could be throughout the sanctuary before anybody else goes back into that sanctuary.
And so I think you covered this on Tuesday, but cleaning logs have to be kept.
Yes, New York requires that you document the date, the time, and the scope of cleaning of each space that is being used for worship. And that includes spaces where people are walking through hallways to get into and out of worship as well, elevators, etc.
And again, if it's a week between touching the choir robes and the Bibles, they should be okay? Or we are guessing on that? Or
are you asking me if I think they're okay, or are you asking me what New York State law says?
What does New York State law say?
New York State law does not have a limit in it that I can find. So the answer would be you still have to clean them.
Okay.
I understand a lot of the research shows that viruses don't survive that long. And so, but that's New York State. I do not see anything in the reopening New York guidelines that allow us to not have to clean.
What would the New York State guidelines tell us about covering a microphone with saran wrap?
And then taking it off each time?
Yeah.
Yes, you could do that. You'd be removing the saran wrap instead.
That's a great idea.
In the same way that if you wanted to make cleaning, if you want to keep your pew cushions in, and you want to avoid having to clean pew cushions and disinfect pew cushions after every worship service, you can get disposable seat covers that you put on the pew cushions, and then you would dispose of the seat covers at the end instead of having to clean all your pew cushions each week.
And so, have you heard anything different since Tuesday about air conditioning?
I've heard nothing different. Air conditioning becomes, from what I can tell, the most highly contentious issue around public gatherings as we move into the hotter weather. Unless you know that you have a filter on that air conditioner that screens out viruses, and if you have a really, really good air conditioner, maybe you do. But otherwise, some people are saying that they are going to be the thing that spreads the virus more than anything else, and others are saying, oh, it's not really that high a risk. So,
okay, you go ahead, and friends, keep adding things to the chat that you would like a question about.
So I'm going to talk about the Lord's Supper now and how you can do communion. And I'm going to start with what the denomination has said, and then I'm going to spend some time on what the ecumenical consultation, which is a much more recent document that just came out this week. The PCUSA document came out more than a month ago, have said. So what our denomination said is communion should be omitted when churches first return to public worship until such a time as it is deemed safe. That's the guidance they've given us. So they're saying when we return, whether that is next week or in September, you should not be doing communion at the beginning. And then it's saying once it is safe to return, do not pass the elements through the congregation. The ecumenical consultation on protocols for worship, fellowship, and sacraments document, which has been a group of clergy, doctors, specialists in viruses getting together and figuring out what to do, has come up with a list of suggestions about how to do communion when you resume doing it. And the first thing they say is that ushers should be masked, and they would be inviting worshipers to either come forward for communion individually or by household groups, however they're seated in your sanctuary. The worshipers would also be masked as they come forward, and the lines would observe social distancing. You would limit the number of people coming in contact with the elements. So whoever is preparing communion, it should be a person probably who would be preparing communion, and ideally maybe the same person serving communion so that you're not exposing the chance of several people who could be sick to the elements. The server who's serving should wear a face cloth, and they should sanitize their hands immediately before distributing the elements. They should do that in view of the entire congregation. And the congregation should refrain, for those of you who do the liturgical responses that are the traditional ones, the Lord be with you, lift up your hearts, we lift them up to the Lord, etc. Those should not be said aloud anymore by the congregation. If you want, you can pause if you're going to keep them in and have the congregation silently mouth the words to the liturgical responses. Also, clergy, while you're doing things like the Great Thanksgiving during the communion, do not do them standing over the bread and the grape juice. You need to do them elsewhere, again, because of even if you're masked, because of the risk of aerosols. So I would normally stand over the bread and the wine, and on the night that he was betrayed, Jesus blessed the bread and gave thanks and broke it, and I would break the bread, right, while standing there and speaking. Do not do that when you go back to communion. You say the words one place, communion is served another place. You need to start serving across the communion table. This is to keep 6 feet of distance. All right. So the communion table helps you stay away from the other person. So whoever the server is stands behind the communion table, and the other person comes up to the communion table, and the server, using pre-cut bread, the server is going to hand the bread into the worshiper's outstretched hand. This will seem much more similar. Those of you who know other Christian traditions, this will be much more similar to the tradition in the Catholic Church, for instance, where the priest used to put the bread literally into somebody's mouth and now puts it into the outstretched hand. The server is doing that role. All right. If you are going to use juice or wine, and people are suggesting that when you start back to communion, you might only start back with bread. But if you are going to use juice, you need to use small cups of juice or wine spread out on trays so that worshipers can take one without touching another. So the typical communion trays that are used from when we pass communion that are like 30 little cups of grape juice, the little shot glasses, if you will, of communion that go into those trays should not be used. Those trays should not be used. You need things further apart. if you're going to use the juice or wine. And
Susan,
then
we've had several people ask if they could just continue to, could they bring their own?
all right, well, I'll get to them one second. And
Okay,
then
sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
You need to provide a basket where worshipers can leave their cups after drinking. You don't touch the cups. You don't have the servers touch the cups. This needs to be a place where they can be put into a basket. That basket can be thrown out as soon as the service is over, with nobody needing to touch individual cups, because the individual cups, if somebody has the virus and is not aware of it, could have COVID on it. So a place where you can drop it very easily. Right? This would be true, and you need to also make sure to reassure your worshipers that they can choose not to take communion without judgment. And that's, I will say I have a soy allergy, and so I can't often take communion in churches if I don't know if there's soy in the bread. And when I worship in some of your churches, and I sit in the pews and I don't go up for communion, I have people who glare at me. Why are you not coming up? Are you refusing to take the elements? There will be people who refuse to come up, feel unsafe to come up for communion, even down the road. You need to make sure that they understand that that's okay. You need to somehow say that during the service. Now, there are two ways to sort of complicate this a little more. One of them is, if you can still get them, and they're hard to get, is there are little pre-packaged communion cups and bread that exist. They come all wrapped in individual packages, and they have a little glass of grape juice in it that you can take the top off of, and they have a little piece of bread in it. Can you use those? Depends how you're going to use them. The danger is, once you open the grape juice and somebody drinks from it, if you're sitting in your pew, you need some way for them to dispose of those right away in a way that's not going to be causing contagion to anybody else if they have the virus. If you're going to have people come up and drink and then drop that somewhere, there's less of a risk. So you need to figure out, if you're going to use those prepackaged communion sets, how you're going to dispose of them without people risking spreading leaving the cups in the pews, or putting them somewhere where somebody else might come into contact with them. If you're going to have people bring their own juice and their own bread, again, you have that same kind of question. They're going to have wrapping on them. How are you going to get rid of the wrapping? Is the wrapping contaminated? If I don't know I have the virus and I'm packing up my piece of bread and I'm bringing a container with grape juice and I'm going to put it somewhere down next to me on my pew, for instance, so that when it's time for communion, I can take out my cup with grape juice in it, I've now contaminated the pew if my cup has my virus on it. And if I put it down at the end, the same thing. So if you're thinking about people bringing their own thing, I guess you could say you must keep it in your own hands all the way through the service, not to put it down. But again, at the end, and you must take it home with you without letting it touch anything in the sanctuary. But you need to work that out somehow so that people are not exposing others by what they're carrying in that way. So I think that goes to the one question, Deb. Are there other questions on communion?
Yes, ma'am. And some suggestions. So put your other hat on here, your polity theologian hat. What about using the cup with the siphon that we use for filling small communion cups, and have server place a drop on each person's bread like a form of intinction? Creativity abounds, Susan DeGeorge. Creativity abounds.
So the cup would be only let me make sure I understand what you're talking about. The cup would be only the server having contact with it. They would put it on the bread and then hand the bread to the individual across the table. Is that what that suggestion
Sounds that way.
That might work, I guess.
Okay. Okay. Then I just want to also reiterate that those little cups, that the combo cups, are pretty cool if you can get them.
Yeah, you just have to figure out how to dispose of them. They are an option, but the disposal is the question.
Right.
And I mean, the environmentalist in me is cringing, but I don't know a way around that. So,
Right, right.
So,
Well, the environmentalist in you has been cringing for months now. I mean, we have
yes,
disposing of
yeah.
a lot of things. Also, and I'm not familiar with this, there are Pez style bread dispensers. Have you heard of that? Hold your hands up.
I've never seen that.
I've never seen that either. I'd like to see that.
Again, it could be the server using that. You would not want the other person coming up to do the open. If you have to push something to get the Pez to bring the bread out, you would not want somebody having to contact with that. You're trying to keep people away from anything common, and anything that would require you coming close to something over and over with hands would be a bad thing. You also ideally even
Oh, we've got it on the chat now. We've got a link to the Pez dispenser.
Okay.
So
Okay, so if it's far enough away, if I can, like from here, from 2 or 3 feet, make the dispenser work and take the bread, it probably would be fine. If I have to touch something, it would probably not be a good idea. As long as the only bread exposed is the piece that you're going to be reaching to take. If you were exposing more than one piece of bread at a time, if they're all there, that would not be a good idea.
Harkening back just a little bit, did we have any guidance as to what a normal temperature is?
It's above 100 point, can't remember if it's 100.5 or 100.3. It's somewhere in there.
Okay, so we can find that out. Yeah.
Yeah, you can look that up online, but it's in that range.
And we also would like the copy or the link to that ecumenical document that we talked
It's
about.
on if you go to the guide that I put together, it's on the last page. It's under Ministry Matters. It's got the link.
Okay.
It's easier than listing. There are like 8 links there that you should be looking at for worship, and they're all there rather than trying to put them in the chat. So,
okay.
Any other questions on Lord's Supper? And then baptism. So the PCUSA suggestion is that you do baptism in a small subset of the congregation for reasons of public health, and then you have the larger church bear witness to it. So we've moved from saying generally we want baptisms to be in the full sanctuary with the full congregation that's present to suggesting right now that it be a small group. So that it be the family, the sponsors, etc. And then that later you acknowledge that in worship afterwards with the congregation as a whole. So yesterday we baptized so-and-so, and so that the congregation can celebrate it, but they're not there for it. The ecumenical consultation has come up with several suggestions. They say that these are good suggestions to sort of flesh out what the PCUSA has said. The presider should wear a face covering. They should provide for physical distancing, not just between themselves and the family of the person being baptized, but also among those not in the same household. So if you have godparents up there, for instance, they should be staying physically distanced from the people in the household of the baptizee, I guess it would be. Don't ever baptize groups at this point. I know sometimes as we move towards confirmation, we have occasions where groups of children, teens who have not been baptized, are baptized together. At this time, do not do something like that. The presider and any assistant should wash and disinfect their hands before and after the baptism, visibly in front of the congregation. That becomes an important thing to actually have the congregation see now. If you're baptizing an infant, the caregiver holds the child during the entire ritual, maintaining a 6-foot distance from the presider, except during the administration of water and the laying on of hands. This means for some of us, changing the kind of liturgy we have. I know in my last congregation, one of my favorite things was to take the child and walk them down the aisle. I would have I loved holding the baby to begin with, but I would hold the baby and then you walk the child down the aisle so everybody could see them. That's not going to happen now. The infant stays away from people with the caregiver only. The presider is to speak again in a low voice. This is to stop aerosols, to avoid breathing on the candidate for baptism, the sponsors, even though you've got a face covering on. You still should not be anywhere near where the aerosols can get through the face covering. And the water should be added to the font from the pitcher at the time of the rite. You gesture over the water. You don't touch the water. Often we like to make it clear, make the sounds of the water and let people see the streaming of the water. You don't touch it because that would contaminate the water, or could. Instead, you just gesture over the water as you're referring to the water in the baptismal font. And the suggestion from the ecumenical consultation is that you use a ladle to pour the water over the head of the candidate, rather than you're taking your hand and pouring it, with a separate basin to catch the water, especially if there's more than one baptism with that family at a time. Now, I know, is Jack Cabaness on the call? I can't see who's on.
He was on the call.
Jack, if you're there, can you talk about your alternate way of doing baptism that you mentioned to me yesterday?
Yes, inspired by some of our Episcopalian friends and others, I was wondering about taking a piece of greenery, a long palm frond, and then dipping the end of the frond into the font, and then using that to sprinkle the person being baptized.
So there are creative ways to do something like that. That would allow you to keep social distancing. It might, what I said to Jack in response was, if it was an infant and you were throwing water at them from a distance, it might scare them. But if it's a slightly older child, that you could build it in, and it could be really an interesting way to do this, rather than a ladle of water coming down. So there are creative ways to think about how to do the baptism that allow you to keep the distance as much as possible from the child or the adult.
So we have a few questions for you.
Okay.
About baptism. Is this a good time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If the building isn't open, could we perform baptisms at a parishioner's home with an elder representing?
Elder representing the congregation? Is that what you're asking?
I'm not asking. Martin, what are you asking?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. So as long as the session has agreed to that under these circumstances with what the PCUSA has said, the answer is yes. That you could baptize that. So it would be you, Martin, and an elder representing the congregation in the presence of the family in the baptism. And then at the next Sunday service, you would find a way to celebrate that with the congregation by holding it up before the congregation.
Casey chimed in that it could be live streamed, or I assume video that could be posted.
That would be great. That would be a good way to do it.
Can you speak to what it might look like to wash your hands in front of the congregation? You can say no.
I can. I mean, the image that I have is one out of Roman Catholicism, where the priest, before he does communion, there is a washing of the hands in a bowl, and in some ways, that's an ancient rite that we don't usually have in our service, but that the Catholic Church has kept, and it's going back in some ways to that sort of thing for the person who's officiating to do that. And I think probably we could go back and train the congregation to why this is an ancient rite, not just a rite in modern Roman Catholicism. So you could do that beforehand in that way. The harder part is for communion. There's not a rite for teaching the congregation to hand sanitize as they get ready to come up the aisle to get communion. You need a hand sanitizer somewhere partway up the aisle so people can.
Or you could use the Lysol wipes, right?
You could use anything that has enough alcohol content, as long as it's above 65% alcohol content.
Right. So one of the newest members of our presbytery would like to know if they could baptize an adult or an older child by pouring water onto their head from the balcony. I'm picturing that too, and I think it's awesome. So Which goes along with the, of course, someone had to mention the squirt gun that's been going around on Facebook. So creativity abounds, Susan DeGeorge,
I
creativity.
think the easiest way to, some of you will not understand this comment, but I think the easiest way to baptize a child safely would be to do it in Animal Crossing, where you could have a water font
Okay,
there.
I'm muting you. I'm muting you. Okay. Okay, please continue. It looks like we kind of have it covered. And please rewrite questions if you have one.
So this is my last thing. And then we can just discuss creatively how to do these different things that are required. But the communication is going to be the most important part of this if you decide to go back to worship. You need to have a plan in place so the congregation knows before it walks into the building what is going to happen in worship and why it's happening. Why am I not seeing 20 people stand in front singing? Why is that not there? I've been waiting for that now for months since I had to go away from the building. Why am I not able to say a prayer together? Why are we not reciting the Lord's Prayer the way we have every day since I started at this congregation 38 years ago, right? They're going to have to understand. That's an educational piece that you need to come up with some creative ways to do before, well before people come back. I mentioned last time, and I'll mention it again because I think it's a good way to make sure sessions understand what people would be walking into. A piece, a blog post that was written by Eric Parker called "So Your Church is Opening Up." And again, it's on the bibliography in the document I put together. But it walks you through from the minute you get to you pull into the parking lot and you get ready to go into the building to all the way when you leave, what it would feel like to put these steps into place and what worship would be like and how the music would be different and how the speaking would be different so that somebody would get a sense of what they would be returning to. So you need to begin to expose people to what this is going to be like. People are really hungry to come back to something familiar. This is not going to be it, at least at the beginning when we go back. Everything, if you think of communion as different, and you think of baptisms as different, and you think of the music as different, and you think of the way the preaching will be done as different, and you think of the way people will be entering and exiting and greeting each other as different. People have to be prepared for that. So that's sort of the last thing. And let's just discuss. It can be questions, it can be creative ideas for how to do things, whatever would be most helpful.
Okay, Susan, before we get to the questions, I'd like to show all of you another little interesting piece, which is at the bottom of your screen under reactions, and there's an applause. And I just want to say that I so deeply appreciate the time and the effort that you have put into this presentation, getting all those documents together and sort of sifting them down into something that's easy and that's shareable with the sessions. And it's just, I'm sure, very much appreciative. So thank you very much for that. So we can get to some more questions in the chat. And we have the question.
Humming, I see humming. Humming is not,
Yes.
Originally was considered an option at the time that the PCUSA put their document together. People thought if you were wearing masks and humming, that would be a good thing to do. By the time the ecumenical consultation came out, that was frowned upon. So in the month, the understanding of aerosols has changed that.
So would you talk a little bit about weddings?
Weddings?
Mm-hmm. And we have a wedding at the church.
It's interesting, the Reopening New York mentions funerals. It does not mention weddings. I think the wedding would be, depending on the size at this point, probably, because it's not part of what's listed in New York, so probably under 10 people now after June 23rd, under 25 people with social distancing you could. Again, it would have the same kind of requirements as far as disinfecting, keeping people apart, not doing unison prayers, making sure the mics are the way they would be, so that nobody is exposed, etc. But I would guess, yes, you could, under those sort of conditions.
There were several statements about the people in the pews who may not, the church members who may not be trusting the information that comes out from the various organizations, the CDC, the NIH, et cetera, and
it's going to be a hard thing. There are going to be
Right.
people in congregations who say you're taking more precautions than you need to take, and there are going to be people who say let's just take off our masks, and you're going to have to find a way as the owners of the building and as the leaders of worship to enforce those anyway. And that's part of so I don't want to wear my mask, and I come in and I've taken off my mask for seating, and I'm seated 6 feet away from people and I'm not speaking. That's okay for the moment. But then I don't want to put on a mask when it's time to leave. Somebody has got to say to that person, you've got to put your mask on as you leave the building, or we can't have you back in the space right now. And this is not something we're good at. We want to welcome people. And that's part of what the Parker article sort of brings up, is the feeling is very different. How do you make this feel welcoming while you're doing all these various safety things? That's what sessions need to conjure with. If you're going back, can you make this work in some way that feels welcoming?
there you go. How about with, back to the wedding again, how about if we have a reception? Is that
No food or drink in the
Okay.
in the buildings.
okay?
The exception would be the communion, but otherwise no food or drink in the buildings at all.
You see any problem with folks humming hymns?
No humming hymns. I sort of covered that with even now the change has been from the denomination, so no humming.
Right. And again, just to acknowledge the exhaustion that church leaders are feeling, trying to implement these things going forward, which is why the recommendation is that you do this very slowly and that you get these things into place before you consider opening your buildings.
Right.
Is there
And it is exhausting, and it does feel. Who was it that just put that up? Was it Mariah? Maybe. It does feel excessive, and it is. We all want to be back together.
Right.
What I'm telling you, this is New York's guidelines that are trying to keep us safe. You need to know. So the document that's on the website, as you move ahead, and I know this is not something you probably want to hear either, but the document, I'm revising the document on a regular basis, about minimally once a week, as New York puts in extra steps. So you need to keep checking that. As we learn more about worshiping together, new steps are going in, right? After Kentucky went back to worship and that one congregation got a good percentage of them got sick from the exposure, there were new suggestions that were added. So CDC is adding things, and New York is adding things. You need to keep checking on that. That's, even though you think you've got your safety plan worked out, it will change over the next several months. Maybe some of it will get easier, I don't know, but there will be other things added as well.
I think you need to remember that you need to be in contact with your insurance company, and that could sway some folks as to what they say. And as Susan has pointed out, in building use, the best way that you can protect yourself is to be able to come back and say, we did the best we could. Here is the guidelines. Here are the guidelines that we followed. So let's see.
I'm looking at bell choirs. Garrett, bell choirs, if they're standing apart from each other, far enough apart, and you disinfect the bells and the handles ahead of time, and then you disinfect them immediately after worship ends, would probably be okay. So if they're wearing robes, you've got the problems of people having to take the robes home. But otherwise, they would probably be fine. And to Aaron's comment about separation of church and state, my guess is that, and this is purely a guess, but the reason that we are in phase 4, let me just explain this. New religious congregations will reopen fully our buildings when we hit phase 4 of the New York Forward. We are not there. The pressure was put on to New York Forward to have worship open early because of the church-state separation push. And that is the reason we have the, yes, you can do up to 25% of your maximum building capacity. So there's the acknowledgement of some church-state separation, but within safety guidelines, and church-state separation has always legally been reined in by safety. And so that's what, when New York State considered this, if you look at cases, safety always outrules church-state separation. So.
Let's see. And again, as I've stressed before, this is a very interesting time in the relationship between pastors and sessions. And what is an elder of a church? And what is the responsibility of being an elder of a church? And the thing that I've seen in the chat that you can't stress enough, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So that's a question that you need to lift up, or a statement you need to lift up. Just because you can open your building physically doesn't mean you should do that. So you have to come to that decision. Your leaders have to come to that decision. And when you are comparing what's going on in New York with what's going on in many other parts of the country that did reopen quickly and that did open up for people, you can see what happens and make your own decision based on facts and numbers.
And it is helpful to me to know, a couple of you have written me to say, I got an email this morning, I had a contentious session meeting last night because of this, this, and this. Around, it's helpful to me to know what questions are coming up around this and where the contentions are, so that maybe we can clarify a bit more for people what are being said. So if, as you go through this, if there are things, if you decide you're going to reopen, it's helpful to know that and what procedures you're putting in. If you decide you're not going to open until certain things are happening, it's helpful to know that. And if there are questions, it's helpful to know. I'm looking at a question from Greg Perry asking information on release forms and documents that members could sign to assume risk. And the answer is, this may not be helpful, but it is the answer at the moment on this. There are, for instance, the New York Stock Exchange, my understanding is, for instance, is having everybody who has gone back to work there sign a liability document saying, I understand that I am assuming a risk by being back in this building with other people, and I am willing to assume it. And you could put in a similar document on Sunday morning when somebody came into worship. What we don't know until the first case comes along where somebody gets sick, but they've been forced to sign that document in order to participate in whether it will hold up or not. We have no idea. So it might give you liability, it might coverage, it might not. Might free you from being liable, it might not.
Susan, Mount Kisco clearly has a wedding that they in their back pocket. And Dale is
How big a wedding? Dale, how big a wedding?
Yeah, 50. So we thought we were good for the sanctuary service with the 25% rule and all those, but then we thought food service would be okay given phase 3 indoor restaurant guidelines and so on. But you're saying that's not necessarily going to open it up.
The food part is not. Probably if you're in the sanctuary and you can fit people social distance appropriately, you probably could get away with that part. The food, you can't have the food because restaurants have different guidelines that they have to meet than we have to meet. And so even as restaurants go from outside dining, as we hit phase 3 to inside dining, right, from takeout to inside, they will be making new plans and new shifts that we will not have the option of even thinking through until phase 4. I should also say, if you read the report that I put together, I'm talking about stages. I got this question from somebody before. Stages, not phases. I use stages because that's what the denomination used, and we're PCUSA. They are not the same. Phase and stage are not the same. All right. So we are not in phase 3 yet. We are in stage 3 of where the denomination considered us to be. I know this is confusing, but I'm working with 2 different groups that are not seeing eye to eye. We are in stage 3 in New York at the moment, phase 2. All right. So stage 3 denominationally, phase 2 New York forward.
As if it could not be confusing enough. We've had a couple people that did want to get a little, and again, folks, we are well past the hour time. So if you need to drop off, we understand, but we would also like to stay around and answer some more of your specific questions. So we've had a couple people refer to ceiling fans again, and just the what that looks like and what that feels like.
You're being asked to keep fresh air flowing, but it depends what your ceiling fan does. And without knowing where your ceiling fans are and what it does, it's a hard question to answer. If it's going to blow air through the sanctuary, that's a good thing. If it's going to recirculate air around the sanctuary so that everybody is breathing each other's air, will feel cooler, but it's not a good thing. So without knowing your individual ceiling fans, I'm sort of at a loss to say yes or no. And I'm not a ceiling fan expert in any way.
Yeah.
Standing fans at windows, again, if it's blowing air out, yes, that would be fine. If you're going to be blowing air from one person into another person's face, then no. So it's how you position them.
Friends, are there other questions on your mind that we haven't covered?
I know we haven't talked much about funerals, and funerals again at the moment are under the 25, are considered in the 25% maximum capacity category. That is listed, unlike weddings that very specifically is listed. And social distancing required, et cetera. The exception in New York State for social distancing that has been illustrated several times is pallbearers. If you're having a casket carried in or out, pallbearers wearing masks and gloves may come within 6 feet of each other while they're carrying the casket in or out. But otherwise, funerals, basically you're operating under the same requirements of the maximum capacity.
Susan Ellen points out that they're making their decisions in 3-month chunks. So that they've decided at this point the building will not be open until September, and then they will decide again at that point. I wish we could predict the state guidelines.
Right, there could be changes between now and then.
Yeah, there certainly could.
Part of the in two different ways. Number one, we'll be in a different phase by then. We'll probably be in phase 4 if everything goes well, unless we're shifted back. Number two, as we reopen more, and we're expecting, the faith-based organization person has said that we're expecting that as we learn where contagions are more apt to happen in congregations, and you'll remember where congregations are put with concerts and educational groups as the higher risk places, right? So we're being watched carefully, and as we learn where contagions are happening within congregations, we can expect that the guidelines will be changed for us. And then as we move into the fall and we move into flu season, we've already been told one of the governor's faith-based liaisons is a woman named Q English, a minister, Q English, who has said that as we move into the fall and flu season, and as COVID comes back as well, as they're anticipating, we will expect other guidelines again at some point in the fall, when flu and COVID are both hitting us again. So I don't know if that will be October or November, but those guidelines will change again then. So all I can say is I'm updating this as fast as I can. Each time they change, go to the website, and Jean is putting them up as fast as she can get it up after I've updated it. Go to the website and check. I'm keeping a date on the bottom. Make sure the guide you're working with is the guide that has the date that's on the website. Because if it's a different date, something has changed, either in the CDC or New York State.
Um, Tricia, are you still on? Could you expand a little bit? Folks are, Ben's curious about
Yeah,
small groups. What is your particular
yeah.
question?
So our session had a lengthy meeting last night, and the issue at hand was, in particular, we have our deacons wanted to be able to meet in person. Session decided against allowing it, and then it was suggested that by one person that he would just then host the meeting at his own home outside, and would they be restricted from doing so by Sessions' decision. We told him no, that he can't do it, but a specific answer could be helpful.
So I don't know, deacons might be, depending on the size of your deacon group, maybe you could go back if they're under 10 people and you can social distance and everybody has an option of participating, because if you have deacons who are under 60 and deacons who are over 60, they both need a way to participate, and it would not necessarily be safe for everybody to come back even with social distancing.
But the question
So-
was about the difference between between using the church property versus somebody, does a church escape liability if somebody does it with their own home? And also,
it's an official church event or an
Yeah.
official church, if it's
Official
an official
church
church
event.
activity, I think you probably would in some ways still be liable because it's an official church activity. If it's not an official activity and this guy just wants to invite the deacons over to hang out unofficially, then it wouldn't be a problem. But if it's an official church activity, it's your event. It's like if you take your youth group on a camping trip, right? And somebody gets hurt, the church can be liable. And that's why you do your forms before somebody goes.
got it. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Anyone want to?
Anybody with creative ideas for baptisms or communions besides Jack? I mean,
Can I just follow up on the
Sure. Who is this?
this is
Oh, Ben, go. Yes.
Sorry. I don't know how realistic this is for us, but it seemed an intriguing option to look at worshiping together in homes. But it sounds as if we might need to follow the same protocols entering to someone's home that we would entering to someone's church. Is that, you think that's generally the best
you
advice?
still have the liability issues if it's your service and you're organizing it as you would. So if you think of, I mean, the place we most see this is with youth groups, right? The youth group goes to an individual's home, you're still liable for the event that's happening there. It would be the same kind of thing. And, you know, somebody asked me yesterday, so is the Department of Health going to really come to every church and begin to check to make sure these things are posted? Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think we have the person power to do that. But the first time somebody gets sick in one of these churches, then we move into a liability question, and then the CDC, the Department of Health, comes in, and CDC could get involved and so forth. So that's where the danger is. So outside, I got the question yesterday on the building thing. If you're worshiping outside, again, you must modify it. If you're doing parking lot worship, your cars have to be social distanced if you're putting windows down. So you can't have two cars that are, 6 inches apart from each other with people sitting next to each other chatting. There has to be enough. So every other parking space or something like that. In order to keep that kind of social distance requirements.
Susan, could you get a little more specific on tracking attendees if the congregation's very small and everybody knows everybody?
So you must, you're being asked to keep track of who comes into and out of your building. Just ideally to screen people. It is not, you cannot make it mandatory. It is encouraged is the language used. You cannot require it, but you are being asked to maintain a log of every person who has close contact with other individuals at your gathering site. All right. It does not require that every attendee be on that log. All right, that's not required because it can't be. You can't force somebody to give you your name. You're encouraged but not required. But anybody who comes on who's a delivery person, anybody who comes on who's a volunteer. And so here you go, you know, sort of the opposite of what I've learned for years in the parish, which was have as many volunteers as possible. That's a good thing to get people involved. Right now, have as few volunteers as possible. Because everybody who's a volunteer, you have to keep a log on as anytime they're in the building, right? So that log needs to be there for New York State. They are asking you to log in, ideally attendees, so that they can be traced if they're contact tracing, if it becomes necessary. And at the very end of the article that I flagged about what worship would be like, you'll see why that is when this guy comes to the end of his article.
Hey friends, we will get this all this information up on the website as soon as we absolutely possibly can today. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I suspect that we will be doing this again as things change and as we get closer. I'd like to close with what Lynn said in the chat, which is we are trying to help people not die. So please, 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 the safety of people that you are bringing into your sanctuary is paramount here. The safety of people that you are coming together with is paramount. So please have that on the forefront of all of your decisions. Please default to safety, default to waiting. This may or may not happen again, and we need to be ready if it does. So please keep that in mind as you talk to your session and as you have these difficult conversations with some folks as to why this is happening. And it is not forever. This is a pause. This is a pause. I'm grateful for each and every one of you and for the hard work that you're doing. So go out and appreciate God's creation at some point today because it's a beautiful day.